Welcome to the Energy Policy Solutions Project. This project is Energy Innovation LLC's effort to help policymakers and the public understand the best ways to reduce emissions and mitigate climate change. The goal is to find policies that will reduce the emission of harmful pollutants at least cost or maximum economic gain, as there are many policies that will simultaneously save money and reduce emissions. It is also essential to ensure that pollutant reductions are large, which does the most to improve public health and mitigate climate change. The challenge policymakers face isn't a lack of possibilities. Rather, they are confronted with a tremendous number of policies that might, or might not, be effective at cutting pollution. Each policy has its advocates, and many have been studied in isolation, but policymakers have limited time and political capital, so they need an objective means of sorting through all of the policy options to understand which ones should be prioritized and combined. This task is made more challenging by the fact that policies interact. The way a policy behaves on its own will often be different from the way that policy behaves as part of an integrated package of policies. For example, a policy that promotes wind power and a policy that promotes energy efficiency will have a lesser effect on emissions when enacted together than the sum of the effects of these two policies enacted individually. That is because some of the energy saved by the efficiency policy comes out of what would have been wind energy created due to the wind policy. The opposite can also occur. Some policy packages are more than the sum of their parts. A policy that promotes electric cars is more effective in combination with a policy that promotes wind power, because more of the energy used to power the car was created without the emission of pollutants. The best way to tackle these kinds of interactions is with a computer model. The Energy Policy Simulator is a system dynamics model. This means that it treats the economy and its energy flows as an open, changing, non-equilibrium system. The simulator is designed to calculate the effects that entire packages of policies will have on emissions of 12 different pollutants and on various financial metrics. To give you a sense of how it works, I'll walk through a simplified example of energy flows in the transportation sector. The actual simulator has a somewhat different and more complex calculation process. The model includes a number of policies that can be set by the user, shown here in blue boxes, such as an increased fuel economy standard for cars or trucks. Usually, a user-set policy couples with other data to determine what happens in the scenario being simulated. For example, there is an existing fuel economy standard already established in regulations. Variables that concern existing policies or other existing data are business as usual, or BAU, input variables. BAU input data may be derived from the text of policies and regulations, published studies, or the published results of other computer models. The user-set increase in the fuel economy standard couples with the pre-existing fuel economy standard to influence the fuel economy of newly sold vehicles. They are not the only factors that influence the efficiency of newly sold vehicles, as you will see shortly. If you know the fuel economy of new vehicles, the size of the existing fleet after retirements from the previous year, and how many new vehicles are sold, you can calculate the fleet average fuel economy. Next, if you know the average distance traveled per vehicle, and you know the total number of vehicles in the fleet, you can determine the total amount of fuel burned. In the model, this is further divided up by fuel type: petroleum, gasoline, or diesel, biofuels, electricity, natural gas, etc. The emissions intensity of a fuel is the amount of a given pollutant that is emitted when a quantity of that fuel is burned by a specific type of equipment. For example, for a given quantity of energy, coal generally emits more carbon dioxide and more particulates than natural gas, so coal has higher emissions intensities for these pollutants. The type of equipment burning the fuel also matters. For example, some types of equipment feature particulate filters, which prevent most of the generated particulates from reaching the atmosphere, thereby lowering the emissions intensity for particulates. If you know the emissions intensities for each fuel type, for each vehicle type, For each of the 12 different pollutants tracked in the simulator, you can determine the total pollutant emissions. Of course, the value of the model is the ability to handle the effects of more than one policy, so let's add in another one: increased taxes on fuel. As we saw with fuel economy standards, a user-set increase in fuel taxes combines with existing fuel taxes to influence the cost of fuel. The cost of fuel influences the distance people drive, as people will drive less when fuel costs more, and also influences the fuel economy of new vehicles, as higher fuel prices will cause buyers to opt for more fuel-efficient vehicles, and it will cause manufacturers to offer more fuel-efficient vehicles for sale. Let's look at another policy: vehicle electrification. Electric vehicles influence the emissions intensity because they don't emit pollutants directly, and emissions from the generation of electricity are handled in the electricity supply sector. It also influences fuel cost. Let's throw in one more policy. A feebate is a fee on inefficient cars that is rebated to the buyers of efficient cars. We could keep going, adding more policies and showing more relationships. But the important point is that all of this is part of the transportation sector, which is just one piece of the entire simulator. Other major parts of the model are the building sector, the industry sector, which includes agriculture, and the electricity sector. The upper three sectors in the gray boxes are the demand sectors. They determine how much electricity is demanded, and then the electricity sector must supply this quantity of electricity, accounting for transmission and distribution losses. Similarly, the simulator includes a district heat sector, which represents the facilities that generate hot steam or water and pump it to surrounding buildings. The district heat sector is not very important in the United States, but the energy policy simulator is built to be readily adaptable to many countries. The model was originally developed for use by the Chinese government, and district heat is important in many Chinese cities. The model includes a module that calculates carbon capture and sequestration. It allows the industry and electricity sectors to sequester some of their carbon dioxide emissions underground, and it increases their fuel consumption in order to provide energy to power the sequestration process. Upstream of these sectors, the model includes an area where many properties of fuels are set, such as costs and emissions intensities. Policies that affect fuel costs across multiple sectors, such as fuel taxes and the carbon tax, are implemented here. The model includes a complete R&D module, allowing the user to specify technological advancement above and beyond the business's usual case. The user can specify improvements in fuel efficiency for fuel-using technologies and reductions in capital cost for any technology. R&D levers are broken down by technology type within each sector. For example, in the transportation sector, this means vehicle types: light-duty vehicles, heavy-duty vehicles, aircraft, rail, ships, and motorbikes. In the building sector, this means building heating systems, cooling and ventilation, lighting, envelope, etc. The last sector is land use and forestry. This sector includes both emissions and carbon sequestration. One major output from all of these sectors is the quantity of pollutants emitted. As noted before, the model handles 12 different pollutants. They are carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, high global warming potential fluorinated gases, or F-gases, PM 2.5, which is particulate matter 2.5 microns or less in aerodynamic diameter, PM 10, black carbon, organic carbon, nitrogen oxides, sulfur oxides, carbon monoxide, and volatile organic compounds. Lastly, the model estimates the direct cash flow changes due to the user-selected policies. Cash flow is tracked separately for government, industry, consumers, and certain specifically broken-out industries. An industry is broken out if the policies affect that industry differently from most other industries. For example, fossil fuel suppliers are broken out, as a policy that improves the efficiency of industrial equipment will save money for industry as a whole, but will reduce the revenue of fossil fuel suppliers. The model handles 51 policies, Or if you count instances such as a tax on coal and a tax on petroleum gasoline to be two different policies rather than aspects of the same fuel tax policy, then the model features over 200 policies. I've already mentioned the pollutant and cash flow outputs. The model also estimates monetized public health and climate benefits, and it can report the makeup of the electricity system, both of which we'll look at shortly. In fact, in the downloadable version of the model, any of the thousands of variables in the model can be an output, so if what you care about is total natural gas consumption, the average efficiency of trucks, or the fraction of building heating systems that run on electricity, the simulator can report out these numbers. We are fortunate to have had contributors and reviewers from top universities, national laboratories, and other great organizations help us build the model and provide valuable feedback. To give one example, Michael Wong and his team at Argonne National Laboratory created the GREET model, an amazing tool for looking at fuels and transportation technologies, which we use to inform the emissions intensities in the energy policy simulator. Michael Wong and his team reviewed the fuels and transportation structure of the energy policy simulator, and their feedback was extremely valuable in improving the model. In addition to the model itself, we have created a number of supporting tools to enhance the model's capabilities. The model comes with several scripts or small programs written in the Python programming language. These scripts allow you to perform large numbers of simulations in an automated manner. The energy policy simulator runs very quickly. A simulation is completed in less than 1 second, which makes it feasible to test thousands of policy combinations. This can be used to help find optimal sets of policies to achieve a target the user has in mind. For example, suppose you are considering the use of 8 different policies to get carbon dioxide emissions down to a particular level. You can use one of the Python scripts to test every possible combination of these policies and log the output data. You then discard all model runs which have CO2 emissions higher than your limit and sort the remaining ones from lowest to highest cost. You have just found the lowest cost way to stay under your carbon cap using your preferred policy levers. A different Python script allows you to rapidly generate the data for wedge diagrams and policy cost curves, which are 2 different ways to visualize the effects of policies within your policy package. I'll show you some examples a little later. We also created a web-based interface so that you can interact with the model via your web browser. This online tool allows you to create policy scenarios, save them to your account on the server, share them with friends, compare multiple scenarios, and more. You can try out the tool by navigating to energypolicy.solutions. A different video provides a short walkthrough of some of the online tool's major features. A link to that video appears in the description for this video. Here is a graph of greenhouse gas or CO2 equivalent emissions for several different scenarios included with the simulator. The business as usual case reflects what would happen if no additional policies beyond those already on the books were to be enacted. This is based on our input data sources, such as the Energy Information Administration's 2015 Annual Energy Outlook, and so it doesn't include the effects of policies that were enacted so recently that there hasn't been time for our input data sources to be updated to include these policies. For example, the final rule for the EPA's Clean Power Plan came out only shortly before the Energy Policy Simulator was publicly released, so none of the input data sources yet factor that rule into the business-as-usual case. The Clean Power Plan scenario is a policy package designed by Energy Innovation to meet the emissions targets set out in the EPA's rule. It specifically uses policy levers that the EPA expects states to use to achieve the Clean Power Plan, such as a renewable portfolio standard and early retirement of some coal power plants. Policies were selected based on their ability to meet the targets at low cost. The Policy Solutions scenario has been designed to meet the United States 2025 emissions target, which was part of the bilateral commitment between the U.S. and China announced in late 2014. This package focuses on the most effective policies, is ambitious but politically possible, and saves money relative to the business-as-usual case. Over the next few slides, I will show you a variety of different sorts of graphs that can be produced with data from the Energy Policy Simulator. The goal is twofold: to share a number of key findings and to provide a taste of the range of different things you can do with this model. This slide shows a wedge diagram that breaks down the emissions reductions inside the policy solutions scenario by policy. We have color-coded them such that purple, a carbon tax, is our cross-sector policy, and other policies are in colored groups by sector. I've added a key to the specific policies to the graph. Note that while the carbon tax is an extremely useful and strong policy, it is very far from sufficient to achieve the United States 2025 emissions target on its own. There is no single policy that is the answer. It is necessary to have an integrated package of policies that address every sector in order to deliver the emissions reductions we need. There is no one correct way to evaluate the cost of a policy package. There are multiple different cost metrics that one might consider, which are useful for different purposes. For example, on the left, we have a graph showing the cumulative change in capital investment for each scenario. Investments in new equipment each year are nearly constant, so the curves for cumulative total investment, that is, all of the additional investment up through the depicted year, are almost straight lines. The graph on the right shows the change in fuel expenditures. In the Clean Power Plan scenario, you start saving money on fuel from day one, as this scenario includes energy efficiency policies, which reduce fuel consumption, and it does not include any additional taxes on fuel. In contrast, in the policy solutions scenario, more money is spent on fuel in the early years of the model run, because this policy package includes a carbon tax. At first, the increased cost of fuel due to this tax is greater than the savings that result from buying less fuel. However, over time, more and more efficient equipment is installed, and all installed equipment from past years generates fuel savings in each subsequent year of the model run. Therefore, fuel savings begin to outweigh the increased cost of the carbon tax before 2023, and the savings on fuel have fully paid for the increased costs of fuel during the early years by 2026. Thereafter, the savings accumulate rapidly. These two graphs show a different way to look at policy package costs. In the preceding costs graph, we made no assumption about what is or is not done with the carbon tax revenue. It was simply added to the cost of fuel. In these two graphs, we assume that the carbon tax is revenue neutral. This means that while the taxes go up on fuel, other taxes are lowered to compensate, so the net effect is not to increase the amount of taxes paid. In these graphs, we are also summing the change in capital investment and the change in fuel expenditures. When we do this, we see that the Clean Power Plan scenario pays for itself in 2026 and saves almost $40 billion through 2030. The Policy Solutions scenario pays for itself by 2019 and saves a total of over $800 billion through 2030. Whenever we look at the direct financial costs or savings of a policy package, it is important to also consider the package's social benefits. Here, we consider two types of social benefit: avoided mortality, that is, premature deaths, due to reduced levels of particulates, and avoided contribution to climate damages. We monetize the avoided climate damages by converting pollutant emissions to carbon dioxide equivalent using the global warming potentials of each pollutant, and then we apply the social cost of carbon established by the United States government. For avoided mortality, we assign a dollar value to premature deaths with a government source that considers population-weighted exposure to pollutants, the relationship between exposure and mortality, and a value of a statistical life, or VSL figure, that economists use to convert premature deaths into dollars. Note that the magnitude of the resulting numbers is very high. The policy solution scenario has achieved almost $4.5 trillion worth of social benefits through 2030. These benefits dwarf the direct costs and savings of the policy packages, as shown on previous graphs. However, it is important to remember that the previous graphs show actual cash transfers, while this graph shows the value of avoided impacts, such as loss of human life, which otherwise would have been suffered without actual cash transfers. Here is another type of output the energy policy simulator can generate: a breakdown of electricity generation by type. All three graphs on this slide have the same axis, scales, and labels, so only the graph in the upper left is labeled. You can see that in the business as usual case, coal generation is mostly flat after 2016. Demand for electricity grows through 2030, and this demand is mainly handled by new solar and wind. In the clean power plan scenario, demand is slightly less, though it still grows through 2030. Coal generation continues to drop throughout the model run, and wind and solar grow more robustly than in the business as usual case. Nonetheless, the differences from BAU are relatively small. Electricity demand peaks around 2020 in the policy solutions scenario. Coal generation is reduced considerably due to a combination of efficiency and increased solar and wind deployment. Here is another way of visualizing the effects of a particular policy scenario. This diagram is a policy cost curve. Each box represents a different policy. In this case, the policies are all part of Energy Innovation's Policy Solutions package. The width of each box along the x-axis represents the greenhouse gas emissions reductions achieved by that policy. The height of each box along the y-axis represents the cost effectiveness of that policy in dollars per ton CO2 equivalent abated. Boxes above the x-axis cost money, while boxes below the x-axis save money. Almost all of the boxes here are below the x-axis because we chose to include predominantly cost-saving policies inside the policy solution scenario. You may have seen similar-looking cost curves developed by the consulting firm McKinsey & Company. Here is an example. Cost curves from the Energy Policy Simulator are different in two important ways. First, McKinsey evaluated the various technologies or actions to be undertaken, whereas each box in the simulator represents a policy. Second, McKinsey evaluated the full technical potential of each measure, resulting in one definitive width and height for each box. In contrast, our boxes change in size and shape according to user settings and which other policies are enabled as part of the same policy package. For example, a lower carbon tax setting would result in a box that has a smaller width and a different height than the box shown here. Therefore, it is important to think of policy cost curves as one useful way to look at the contents of any given policy package, not a definitive statement of the costs or abatement potentials of any given policy. One of the Python scripts included with the model is designed to perform an automated series of model runs that rapidly outputs all of the data necessary to create a policy cost curve for any given scenario. Here is one last example of a capability of the Energy Policy Simulator. The simulator can be used to perform Monte Carlo sensitivity analysis, which will tell you how sensitive any output variable is to changes in any particular input variable, or more than one input variable of your choice. As an example, here we performed 1,000 model runs in which we varied the price of natural gas. We looked at the historical range of natural gas prices over the last 2 decades and varied future natural gas prices in the model by this same range, centered on the predicted price from our input data sources. The red shaded area on the graph represents the 90% confidence interval for U.S. total greenhouse gas emissions. We find that emissions vary by plus or minus 3% based on natural gas prices. A 6% swing in total U.S. emissions due to natural gas prices is very substantial, but it is not overwhelming. The policy packages we looked at earlier would achieve reductions that are much larger than what could be expected from variance in natural gas prices. This technique can be applied to estimate the sensitivity of any variable, such as solar deployment or particulate emissions, to changes in any policy lever or non-policy input data, as in our natural gas price example. At this point, I would like to remind you of the web application interface, which allows you to use the simulator via your web browser. It is available at energypolicy.solutions. A brief walkthrough on how to use the web interface is available in a separate video. A link to that video appears in the description for this video. Thank you for taking the time to learn about the Energy Policy Solutions Project. We hope findings from this project and the tool set we have released may be useful to you. With well-designed policy, many nations can save human lives, reduce pollution, and save money.